Good afternoon or good evening, everyone, and welcome to our AWS webinar on how to review a manuscript. I'm Dr. Marion Henry, the chair of the AWS Publications Committee, and I'd like to quickly introduce the team of AWS Publication Committee members who've put together this webinar and will be hosting it tonight. First off is Dr. Caitlin Hicks. She's a vascular surgeon and associate professor of surgery at Johns Hopkins University. And I owe Caitlin a huge debt of gratitude for putting together this outstanding panel of speakers and really making sure this webinar came off tonight. Our second team member is Dr. Lisa Cañada. She is an orthopedic trauma surgeon in Jackson, Florida, associated with Novant Health in the Houston Clinic. She was formerly professor and program director at University of Florida in Jacksonville. Dr. Jennifer Plichta is a breast surgeon and assistant professor of surgery at Duke. And soon to be Dr. Madrusi Zope is a fourth-year medical student at Baylor College of Medicine. So thank you so much to this incredible team, and they are going to take it away. We are very excited to have everyone with us tonight, and we're pretty equally divided amongst students, residents and fellows, and attendings, which is very exciting that we can appeal to such a wide audience. So with that, I will let the team take it away and introduce our panelists as we move forward.
Thanks so much, Dr. Henry. We're excited everybody could join us today, and it looks like we have a good turnout already. Just one housekeeping note, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. We'll be monitoring those questions that are immediately pertinent to the talks. We will fit in at the end of the talk, and then we'll have some time for discussion at the end. So without further ado, our first speaker is Dr. Herb Chen. Dr. Chen is the chair of the Department of Surgery at University of Alabama at Birmingham and the surgeon-in-chief of UAB Hospital and Health System. He is the editor-in-chief of the American Journal of Surgery and serves on many other editorial boards as well. He has published over 540 original research articles with a focus on notch signaling in thyroid and neuroendocrine cancers, and he is widely recognized for his passion for teaching and mentoring the next generation of surgical leaders. We are very grateful for Dr. Chen to join us tonight, and I'll let him take it away.
Thanks so much, Caitlin. It's my honor to be invited to speak, and it's fantastic to see such a great turnout tonight. All right, so I'm just going to briefly talk about how to get involved with the American Journal of Surgery. And I think Caroline is going to provide more detail later on about how AWS members can be engaged with the AWS issue. But there's, I think, a lot of ways that AWS members can be involved outside of that. So this is our editorial team, and we have 8 associate editors, which many of them AWS members, who basically manage submissions throughout our year on all the different topics ranging from trauma, GI surgery, endocrine surgery, breast surgery, and so forth. And I just want to acknowledge their hard work for the journal. If you have been following us, you can see that we rolled out a brand new cover in January of 2021. I took over as editor-in-chief just last year, and we really wanted to change the image of AJS and really focus on, I think, things that are really surgeons are talking about, things that are important in the lives of surgeons and the careers of surgeons. We're so proud to have societies which call AJS publication. And of course, the one we're highlighting tonight is, of course, the AWS, which has had such a strong relationship with AJS. And that was really impressive when I took over, how organized the AWS issue is and the talented editors which serve every year for the AWS. And we have 3 of them that serve as editors for our journal on a rotating basis. But we're also proud to be the journal of all these societies, and our newest affiliation is with the Latino Surgical Society, which joined AJS just this year. One of the areas which AJS really has been focused on and will continue to be focused on is diversity, equity, inclusion. And I know Dr. Kibbe is going to talk a little bit about that later on today. But this is a space that we want the journal to play a bigger role in. And so when I talk about ways to get involved with the journal, we would invite you to contribute in this area moving forward, and I'll provide more detail on how to do this. But this is just a statement that our editorial team put out very early in 2020. So how can you get involved? Well, we would love if you submitted your best research articles to our journal. And that's even outside the AWS issue, because we take submissions year round. And just to let you know about the different types of articles that we take, of course, we take original research articles, and shown on this slide are sort of the components of an original research article. And for the AWS issue, most of the papers are original research articles, but we also welcome review articles. And a new feature in our journal, which we just started in 2020, is called My Thoughts. And this is what we invite people to submit shorter articles. The My Thoughts are on editorials on emerging topics, which are generally about 3 pages in length. And also My Surgical Practice is another type of article, a shorter article about 3 pages, which we invite people to submit, would focus on lessons learned in surgical practice. And the 5th type of paper that we publish is called an invited commentary. That's in every issue, we ask surgeons to comment on some of our featured papers, and we would love to get more of the AWS membership involved in doing that. Oops, let me go back one. And so this is just an example of My Thoughts article, which was written last year. And we published about 6 or 7 of them every issue. And this is just one on the anti-Asian sentiment in the United States around when COVID came. And what we really like to see is very provocative articles that lead to a lot of discussion. And as I said before, the space that the journal wants to be in is in diversity, equity, inclusion, and starting those conversations. And so again, we welcome anyone who wants to submit My Thoughts articles in this space. I would also welcome you to follow us on Twitter. You can see it on my slides. That's our Twitter handle at AMJ Surgery, which we try to feature a lot of the articles. And if you publish, we will also put your articles on. We have a fantastic social media team. And as I mentioned before, you can get involved by writing invited commentaries. And so on the cover of our journal, you can see we select a few feature articles that we think are going to be widely read, and we ask a leader in the field to make a comment on that article with an invited commentary. And this is just an example from one of our past issues here. But if any member of the AWS is interested in writing invited commentaries throughout the year, I'll show you my email at the end of the presentation, and you're always welcome to send me an email. But we'd love to get more people involved doing this. You're going to hear a little bit about how you can review for the journal, especially for the AWS issue. As I mentioned, Caroline's going to talk in detail about that. And I'm just so happy we have a great history of getting multiple members of the AWS involved in peer review. We recently put out the AWS issue just at the end of last year in November. And we featured some fantastic papers and had some great discussion around them. And we look forward to this issue every year because it is actually one of our most heavily cited issues throughout the year. And these articles are cited for a long, long time as well. And of course, we featured the presidential address, which was Sharon's piece was fantastic this year. And so outside of participating in the process for AWS, I would invite you, you can review throughout the year for the non-AWS articles. So if you just want to get involved with our journal, we also have committees that work on social media, our website, and so forth. And so anyone that wants to get more involved or learn more, you can just email me here. My email is pretty simple. It's herbchen@uab.edu. So that
Thank you,
is,
Dr. Chen.
oh, you bet.
Thank you.
I want to jump in with one quick question because I know you're going to have to leave us a little bit early. You know, when you're looking for reviewers for the AJS in general, are you taking people of all ages, or do you prefer attending physicians, or what?
So we take people of all ages. So we do have, of course, a lot of attendings that do it, but we do have a lot of residents that review. And for some younger residents who might not have done it, we often pair them or ask them to find an attending who will do with them initially. But then we, once they do a few, we invite them to be full reviewers. And I think the residents get particularly skilled at it because as a resident, not only obviously are you doing your reviewer, but you also see the reviews of attendings that are reviewing the same paper, and you get that feedback. And I try to give a little bit of feedback as well to them. So yes, we welcome people from all ages to be involved.
All right, thanks so much, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Dr. Chen, we appreciate your time. Next, I'm going to introduce Dr. Hina Santry. She is going to talk to us about what to consider before accepting a review. Obviously, any editorial board wants everyone to just hit accept, but she's going to provide some insight into this wonderful topic. Dr. Santry is an associate professor in the Division of Trauma, Critical Care, and Burns at The Ohio State University. She is currently in her second of 3 years as serving as the guest editor for the Association of Women Surgeons issues just mentioned in the American Journal of Surgery, and is also on the editorial board of surgery. She is the founding director of the Center for Surgical Health Assessment, Research, and Policy, also known as SHARP, at Ohio State. And her research interests focus on improving quality and outcomes for vulnerable emergency general surgery populations. Dr. Santry.
Thank you for the kind introduction and to the Publications Committee for asking me to speak today. So let's see, let me maybe start from the beginning of my slides. So what to consider when accepting a review. I'm really excited about this because there will come a time when you'll get your first invitation after you've published a few papers. Someone will find you based on an interest that is relevant to a paper that's submitted. But then after a while, you'll get a lot of invitations. And how do you decide? And so of the things to think about, you know, from my perspective, one of the first things that you should think about is it a legitimate journal? There are a lot of predatory journals. And there is an easy way through Google Scholar and through a PubMed search to find out if a journal is a legitimate journal. Obviously, the people who are speaking today are all, you know, on the editorial boards and editors-in-chief of legitimate journals. And there are legitimate journals around the world. It's not just journals that originate in the United States, but it's important to make sure that, you know, you're going to put in time to do a good review, that the journal that you're reviewing for is not a predatory journal. The next thing to think about is, are you interested in the topic? Is it something that you feel compelled to learn more about, to get a chance to, you know, provide an opinion as to the quality of research that was done around a topic? Even if you're really excited about something, you have to consider, do you really have the expertise to do a thorough review that will help you judge whether or not this publication is worthy for the journal that you're reviewing for. And more importantly, because very few journals have an acceptance rate that, you know, everything you see gets in, is will you be able to provide the kind of feedback that ultimately strengthens the work? So I'm not a basic scientist, and when things come through that are laboratory oriented, and I got picked because I'm a trauma surgeon that, you know, wrote about sepsis before, I don't say yes to review those things, because it's probably best that someone who works in the laboratory understanding the pathogenesis of sepsis is the reviewer for that. Are there any potential conflicts of interest? So when you are looking at an invitation to review, there are two possibilities. There may be a blinded option, which is less common, or there'll be an unblinded option. And what that means is that even if the authors don't know that you were a reviewer, you are able to see who the authors are if it is an unblinded review. And when it is unblinded, if you worked with that person or worked on an earlier version of the project, they're a beloved mentee from years ago and you have a strong relationship with them, or you just submitted a grant last week that is on the exact same topic and you feel conflicted, or you feel that you might have been scooped on a project that you've been working on, if there is any way that you cannot be an unbiased juror, so to speak, then you have to recuse yourself and say no. So the potential conflict of interest can be related to the topic or the people. And obviously, if it's blinded and you don't know the institution or the people that are authoring the work, then it simply would be based on the content. Have you seen this before? And the reason why I mentioned this is a certain element of unconscious bias may go into your review if you have seen this exact paper in a potentially moderately different iteration for a review for a different journal. So oftentimes you will have done a review, perhaps it did not meet the bar for whatever that journal was in order to be accepted for final publication, but then it goes to another journal, potentially goes to another journal. And if there's a chance that you might harbor some bias having seen it before, and not really be able to give a fair shot to this new version of it, then that's another reason why you might want to consider declining an opportunity review. Critically important to the editors and to the authors is, do you have time? In general, this is not always the case, but in general, once you get the invitation to review, you will have the opportunity to click, yes, I agree. And at that point, the clock starts to give you 14 days from the time of acceptance. Again, that's in general. So look ahead. Are you going to be able to give due time to doing a thorough review? And the later speakers will talk about the content of the thorough review. But even if you're super excited and you have no conflicts and you definitely want to do this, you need to make sure that you can do this in a timely fashion. It's very frustrating for editors to not be able to get a timely review in. The next item is, will you be available for re-review? So oftentimes, in fact, the majority of time, manuscripts will not get accepted on the first go around. But if they get ranked high enough from the multiple reviewers who review it, it will often come back to you as an original reviewer to re-review, to see if your feedback and the feedback of the other reviewers was properly incorporated. Do you have a sense, if you think into the future, 6, 8, 12 weeks, is that aligning with a major deadline that you have, or a career transition, or a move from residency to fellowship, or fellowship to faculty time? That's something to consider, although not as important a factor, in my opinion, as the time to do the initial review. Oftentimes the re-review will go out to each of the original reviewers, but having feedback from just one or two is adequate. And that's what I have to say about, figuring out when you should accept a review.
Thank you so much, Dr. Santry. We are going to move on, and we'll get all questions at the end. So Dr. Plichta.
Excellent. Everybody can hear me okay? Dr. Santry, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. It's my pleasure to introduce my former colleague, Dr. Sosa, who is a professor and chair at UCSF Department of Surgery now. She's the editor-in-chief of the World Journal of Surgery, having served previously as deputy editor at JAMA Surgery. Sorry, my screen just moved. And associate editor of the Journal of Surgical Research. She is widely published in outcomes analysis, as well as cost effectiveness analysis, meta-analysis, and survey-based research. Welcome, Dr. Sosa.
So thank you so much for that kind introduction and for the privilege of presenting this evening. I'm going to be talking to you about what is an editor looking for in a review. My email and my Twitter handle are shown here. Let's see. There it goes. Good. These are my disclosures. They don't really pertain to this presentation, with the exception of the fact I am an editor-in-chief of the World Journal. I'm on several editorial boards, and perhaps most relevant, I am an author myself. So I have 10 minutes, so I figured I'd do a top 10 list for all of you. Some of you may be too young in the audience to remember who invented perhaps the top 10 list. It was this guy, David Letterman, a creature of the 1990s, early 2000s. But like an editor-in-chief, or maybe like a peer reviewer, if you do the job long enough, you sort of get old doing it. And this is, of course, what David Letterman looks like today. So we're going to go through the top 10 things to think about to be an effective reviewer. Number one, I advise always starting your review with a brief recap of the study. It shouldn't be elaborate, it shouldn't be long. The purpose of it is to demonstrate both to the editor-in-chief and to the authors that you actually read the manuscript and understand the science. So just a précis, maybe 2 or 3 sentences. Authors feel better, reassured knowing that you did this. And what I like to use it for is to highlight the features of the manuscript that will set the stage to justify your final recommendation or decision. Number 2, always provide useful and helpful advice. Write with kindness and respect. There is no place in surgery, and certainly no place in peer review, for disparaging remarks or sarcasm. I always say, imagine you are the author who is on the receiving end of your comments. I think it is helpful for editors and for authors to organize comments. Now, you could organize comments based on the sections of the manuscript, from the abstract to the background, methods, results, and conclusion, or you could divide them into major versus minor comments. When you give a peer review, please be careful. Review your syntax, review your grammar, keep the bar as high as it should be for the authors themselves. And most importantly, please provide a timely review. You heard this from Dr. Santry. If you're gonna be late, don't bother agreeing to do the review. Number 3, is this the right journal and the right audience to read the submission? So that really requires that you understand the mission and the readership of the journal. In the end, is the manuscript well suited, well targeted in that light? And that could be its content, the kind of study it is, so basic science versus clinical, and also the impact. If this is a confirmatory study or a study demonstrating the null hypothesis, this may be better suited for a lower impact journal than one that will transform practice. And if you're going to suggest that it is not well suited for the journal, I think it's always important to be helpful for authors to potentially support an alternative venue. Number 4, were the author instructions followed? Now, most journals have managing editors or an editorial office that will already have screened the manuscript for this. And certainly we hope that authors review the instructions for authors prior to submission, but it always baffles me how often these things don't happen. So as a reviewer, think about, is the submission category appropriate? Are there too many authors? Is the manuscript formatted appropriately? Is the length appropriate? Is it too long for the submission type? Are references formatted correctly? And the one where I see most often reviewers cut corners is they read the body of the manuscript, but they don't look at the accompanying figures. Please look at the figures. Are they the right number? And are they well presented and of appropriate quality? Number 5, is the study novel? So hopefully as a thought leader, you'll be familiar with the literature as a content expert, but even if you are a thought leader, sometimes you are not completely contemporary or current. So some journal websites will facilitate a quick PubMed best done study in the world that is simply confirmatory, and the umpteenth study showing the same thing is not particularly novel. Number 6, is the research question important? So is there an aim or a set of aims described, and is there a hypothesis? Certainly there is a place in science for hypothesis generation, but probably the best studies are hypotheses confirmatory. So do the results presented respond to the aims, and are they tied to the hypothesis? And in the end, who cares? Will practice potentially change? And are the findings generalizable? I would say there is rarely now a place for the single surgeon, single institution study. Number 7, was IRB approval obtained? So that's for human subjects research. If this is an animal-based study, it could be IACUC approval. So please look for that in the study. If you don't see it, you can ask for this in your comments or assume that it was not obtained if that is not presented. Number 8, is there methodologic rigor? So are additional experiments needed if this is basic or translational research? Is sample size appropriate, and is a power calculation provided? We're not asking that you be a biostatistician, though hopefully you have basic analytic skills. If the methodologies presented are beyond the scope of your expertise, it is appropriate to ask for a biostatistician to take a look. Nowadays, the best journals have a biostatistician who is a member of the editorial board who can augment your clinic or scientific opinion. Number 9, so there's a lot of meat that has gone into the review so far, but when the day is done, the associate editor, deputy editor, or editor-in-chief want you to make a final recommendation. And that could be slightly different based on the journal. Most have the accept and reject options, but in between there are variations on a theme, which could extend from a minor or major revision to a reject and resubmit to a transfer. And that transfer could be to a sister journal that is part of a publishing house, or it could be of an open journal that is linked to the journal that you have submitted to. And then finally, number 10, the confidential remarks. So everything up to now, except for the final decision, is open to the authors to read. But then there is often a section for confidential remarks read only by the editorial leadership. This is where you can provide the background that you may not want to share with the authors. While I encourage people to be honest in this area, you should never be disrespectful or rude. You should always be evidence-driven. And what I say is never say anything I would not want the authors or anyone else to actually read. I know Dr. Kibbe is a real expert in the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and I know she will be speaking about this, But the number 11 bonus point is review via a DEI lens. Many of us now are recruiting editors who are diverse with diverse backgrounds. Some journals, like World Journal of Surgery, have an ombuds who looks at all accepted manuscripts through a DEI lens. But I would challenge all peer reviewers to be active and intentional in how you think about diversity, equity, and inclusion when you perform your review. In the end, the best reviewers are themselves authors. I know mentors and sponsors say no. This is one where I encourage people to say yes. Consistently good reviewers are ultimately invited to be candidates for ed boards. And if you're inexperienced, it's okay. Partner with seniors to co-review and train yourself up to be the best possible reviewer. Taking courses like this one are certainly one way to do that. Again, thank you so much for the opportunity of presenting today.
Thank you, Dr. Sosa. That was fantastic. Exactly what I expect from you. So absolutely wonderful. I hope everybody was able to pick up a few points. Myself, I think I've learned 10 new things just looking at the top 10 things I need to be doing. So thank you so much. Next, I'd like to introduce future Dr. Zope, who's going to be introducing our next speaker.
Thank you for that intro. And thank you, Dr. Sosa, once again for joining us and for the tips. Next, we have Dr. McGuire. Dr. McGuire is a professor in chief of the section of breast surgery at the Virginia Commonwealth University. She serves as editor for the joint AWS and AJS issue. Her prolific work spans surgical management of breast cancer after neoadjuvant therapy and reconstruction post-mastectomy. She will be speaking on how to structure a review. Dr. McGuire, you have the floor.
All right, well, thank you for that very, very kind introduction. Some of my comments do overlap with Dr. Sosa's, which I think proves that great minds think alike, at least I hope so. So I am going to talk to you guys tonight about how, once you've accepted that review, once you've thought about what you're going to say, how are you actually going to structure this review? It was a pretty dry topic, so I am going to try to zhuzh it up as much as I can. So, oh goodness. All right. So really the three things that I'm going to focus on are how a good review helps, how a bad review hurts, and what does good structure look like? So why do we even care? Because structure is important. You wouldn't go about writing a manuscript and not having structure to that manuscript. It puts all the elements together in a way that makes sense to the reader. And those readers are multiple. So a good review helps. It's helpful for the author. Receiving a review is stressful. Many of us have been on the receiving end of reviews, and we know that clear communication will lead to a better final product for that person or those persons. It's helpful for the editor. Deciding a manuscript's fate is stressful. I've only been a guest editor, and I can tell you it's one of the more stressful things I've done other than operating on patients. Clear communication facilitates an easier decision on the editor's part, and it's helpful for the reviewer. Reviewing a paper can be stressful. The first few times you do it, you're not quite sure what you're doing. So having a consistent structure and style to your review will make it easier to write. So how does a bad review hurt? As you can see here, poor communication leads to bad outcomes. So a bad review can really not be particularly helpful to the author. It's if you're not specific, if there's not enough detail. So for example, you say, excellent article, correct the English. Well, that's not particularly helpful or specific. Or if you sweat the small stuff. So some of the things that Dr. Sosa talked about, being subjective or destructive in the review rather than constructive. Some of these things can be not particularly helpful to an editor. If comments do not correlate with your recommendation, you leave a glowing review, but ultimately say that the article is rejected and you don't give a reason for that rejection. That recommendation without supporting evidence can be so unhelpful. Even if it's an approve, give some reasons why you're approving it. Give some reasons, some ideas as to what could potentially improve the potential product. And these things can be not helpful to you as a reviewer. It takes longer to write something that's disorganized. And if you write something that no one can understand because of lack of organization, you're likely not to be asked to review again. So what does a good review look like? There's lots of iterations. I kind of went with my favorite one, and you can see some of these details at the website down below. But I'm a big fan of the feedback sandwich, and so that's where you start in your summary. This was I think a Carnegie concept, but I use it in a lot of my reviews, where you're going to give your positive feedback up front. You're going to give some of the negative feedback or constructive criticism in the middle, and then some more positive feedback at the end. This is where you're going to summarize that paper so that you do demonstrate that you know what the paper's about, but it also just gives some basis upon which to give your review. You're going to offer up the context in which this manuscript lives in the world of its peers. So is it new data? Is it confirmatory data? What is the significance of it to that field? And this is where you can talk about the strengths, quality, and completeness of the article. So very briefly, just giving that last little bit of positive feedback before you get into some more specifics. So the first thing I'll start with after the summary are the major issues, because these are places where you may stop. This may be where we're talking about things that make this an unpublishable article. And so should you find major issues with the manuscript, you want to talk about their severity and the impact upon the publishability of that paper. You want to talk about, does the article reference similar work? Has it ignored important papers that already exist in the field? Does it address opposing work and explain why their conclusions are different from previous work? Presentation and format. Is this something where this is a completely unreadable article? Like a good review, a good manuscript has a very specific way of being presented. And there's a general way, and then there's a journal specific way. And if the article does not fit those criteria, then this is a place to mention that. And then ethical issues, sort of your fatal flaws. Plagiarism, human subjects protection issues, lack of IRB approval, things like that can be mentioned in the major issues. And so those are the major things you want to hit on before you move to some of the more minor things that can be easily knocked out. So clarity. So this is not the lack of structure whatsoever to a manuscript. Are there little bits that could be clarified? References, are the references appropriate? Are they formatted correctly, or in the proper order? Factual, numerical, or unit errors. So small little things. Perhaps the p-value is not reported correctly, or it looks like there's something in a table that doesn't exist in the text. And speaking of figures and tables, are there too many of them or too few of them? There's very specific requirements for each journal. Are there too many figures and tables? And even if they fit within the journal requirements, do you think there are too many figures and tables? And are they labeled correctly? Oftentimes you'll receive a manuscript and you won't have the proper labels, which makes it really difficult to understand what the author is trying to get across with their figures and tables. Again, those confidential comments to the editors. This is probably one of the things that most people have a lot of difficulty with, unless there's some pre-specified fields in that confidential comments box, which I see more and more often. This is where you do want to make a recommendation, and you're going to make that recommendation again more formally later, but you can discuss with the editor what your recommendation is going to be. If you don't feel comfortable bringing up the ethical issues in your main review, this is where you can bring up things like plagiarism, fraud, unattributed work, unethical procedures, duplicate publications, bias, or other conflicts of interest that have been unreported. So if you don't feel comfortable addressing them with the authors in the author review, you can bring them up with the editor here. But just like Dr. Sosa said, you need to be honest but respectful. Use that golden rule. Imagine that the authors can read this section. And finally, you're going to get to the recommendation. So you're either going to give it an accept, a major or minor revision, or a rejection. And usually this is just a drop-down box that you can click on. So you want to make sure that you click on the right one, first of all. If you're accepting, again, details, details, details. Don't just accept something because you don't want to write the full review. No manuscript is perfect. Any helpful information should be included. Major versus minor revisions, specific changes that the author can use as a structure for their reply should be made. And if you're going to reject something, what can the authors do to improve it? And as others have said, what other journals might you recommend for resubmission? So really quickly, I wanted to show you what this might look like. And because I cannot show you an actual review, I have made an example. And because it's getting late in the day on the Eastern Seaboard here, it's not necessarily true to form. But so this is how I would write a review for a manuscript. So here we have the authors present their manuscript, Why Puppies Make People Happy. This study builds on previous work by Fido et al. In the important fields of both puppies and happiness. This work is novel, however, in its specificity regarding the phenotypes of puppies and in its use of a recent validated instrument to measure happiness. I have a few comments, questions regarding the study manuscript below. So here you're going to go into your major issues. 1, as stated above, the previous work by Fido et al. Demonstrated that all puppies make all people happy. This study concludes that there are only specific subsections of puppydom that produce that same effect. More attention should be paid to this topic in the discussion. Number 2, the authors do not address an important related topic published widely upon by Fluffy et al. Regarding the effect upon human happiness by kittens. Discussion and references should be added. Now we can get into our more minor issues. We can talk about references and how they might be reordered to match the text. You can say that there are misspellings in the text. Dog is misspelled doge many times throughout the text. The snout of the animal is referred to as a boop in the discussion, which is colloquialism. This should be removed or explained in greater detail. Or you can talk about the legends. Table 1 does not specify whether number of puppies or happiness is in the X or Y axis, which obviously would make it very difficult to interpret. Your confidential comments to the editors are where you're going to make that recommendation. So you can overall just say, because you know you've got that click box coming, this manuscript is worthy of publication after the above mentioned edits. It adds significantly to the field of puppy euphoria and is also hypothesis generating for studies throughout the domesticated animal kingdom. And then ultimately for a review like this, I think a fair recommendation would be minor revision. Even the major issues are easily amended. You're not going back to the data, the data harvesting to do these major revisions. And your minor issues are also pretty easily addressed. So with that, I will thank you for the inspiration for my example, and I will hand it back over to the rest of the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. McGuire. And your example was just phenomenal. It definitely would be an example for others. And hopefully this will help everyone in actually formulating the review. Next, we want to hear from Dr. Stephanie Bonney. She is going to talk about a reviewer checklist. She is currently an associate professor of surgery in the Division of Trauma and Surgical Critical Care at Rutgers, New Jersey Medical School in Newark, New Jersey. She is a medical director of the center's hospital-based violence intervention program and multiple related programs to gun violence. Dr. Bonney has served on the AWS Council as the Communications Committee co-chair and also as the senior editor of the American Journal of Surgery issue. She is currently in the middle of a 3-year clinical fellowship with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Clinical Scholars Program, studying how legal and health exchanges can improve social determinants of health in urban populations. Dr. Bonney.
Thank you for that introduction. So as was stated, I was the senior editor for the most recent issue of the AWS AJS issue. And I learned a lot about peer review in that process. And I definitely want to encourage everybody to get involved no matter what your level is, because I think that there's a lot to be learned. And I even learn a lot just like looking at the way that other reviewers, like when it comes back the second time, looking at the other reviewers' comments and seeing how they align with mine or don't align with mine, or what they found that I didn't find. So I'm going to share my screen. So I think one of the things that's helpful is to use checklists. I use checklists for everything from ICU care all the way to setting up camp for my kids. So I think there's lots of use for checklists in our lives, and it makes sure that we don't forget anything. I'm going to reiterate a lot of the things you've already heard tonight on this webinar, but I'm going to sort of bring it all together into sort of a complete form. So when you are formulating your responses to an article that you've been asked to review, you're going to be responding both to the author and to the editor. So those are your two audiences, and your responses to the author are going to look very different than your responses to the editor because they're looking for two different things, and those responses have two different purposes. So as has been mentioned, the first thing on the checklist is, was this research done in an appropriate way, and was IRB approval or exemption done, and was it stated properly in the study, because that's really important. And we want to make sure that we're maintaining high standards of human subjects protections. So let's start first with the response to the author. So once you're going through the paper, you want to start, as has been said, with a summary statement. So reiterate the purpose of the study and then the results as you interpreted them. And so that's going to tell the authors what other people are able to read, what other people are getting out of the paper. And if it's something completely different than what they intended, then that's really valuable to them, because it tells them that they're not getting their message across. Then, as has been mentioned, look for topical relevance. Is this the right journal? Is this relevant to this specialty? And how so? And can you help improve it so that it is relevant to this specialty? I do a lot of work in urban violence prevention. And so, surgery journals aren't always the right place for that. Sometimes I have to look to other journals for relevance for some of the work that I do. So that's, I think, really key and important in thinking about the readership of the journal. And then novelty. Has this been done before? And just, run your own literature search. It's very easy to do. And sometimes the journal will do it for you, or the software that the journal is using. So now, once you've done that, once you've sort of summarized, now it's time to go back through the manuscript section by section. So for each section, and I just want to reiterate, this is actually all outlined by the publications committee in their how to review a paper manuscript. So you can always go back and look at this, but this is essentially the checklist that we recommend from the AWS. So the background, does it set the stage? Does it help you understand why this was something that the authors were interested in and wanted to work on? Does it help the reader understand why this work is important in the world? And are key landmark papers in this area cited? You want to make sure that the authors are really aware of what's been done and what is what the scope of the work is. Are the primary aims and secondary aims clearly stated? And you really understand why the authors embarked on this? And then, are the study methods appropriate for those particular aims? And are there additional methods that could be used to improve upon the research? Then you look at the statistics. Is the study appropriately powered? Is the correct statistical analysis used for the data that they have? Were the people who were performing the data analysis qualified to do so? Or did they describe it in a way that makes you believe that they had qualified statisticians doing certain kinds of research? This can be really important in things like qualitative research. And qualitative research it's more than like recording an interview and like popping out some words. There's real analysis involved in that involves pulling out themes, and it's really important that that's done in a thoughtful way by somebody who's experienced, or that it was at least reviewed by somebody who is experienced. And then basic science can be the same thing, where the people who were doing these experiments qualified and have expertise and experience in doing this kind of basic science research. And then mixed methods. The term mixed methods gets thrown around a lot, and I think probably a lot of people don't fully understand what that means. And so really looking, drilling down and seeing if the methods used were appropriate to call it a mixed methods project. Are the measures of statistical significance indicated? That should be sort of fairly easy. And does the analysis need to be reviewed by a statistician? And most journals will offer that, or actually offer it as a question: do you think this paper would benefit from review by a statistician? Then you look next at the results. Are the results clear and logical? Do the results address the stated aims? So, or is this like something totally different? Are there any key data points that are missing? And is there initial data analysis that could help support these aims? And then the discussion. Is the discussion presented in a clear and systematic way? Are the strengths and the weaknesses of the data identified? Are any unexpected results brought to attention and discussed? Do the authors compare and contrast their study to the available literature on the topic? And most importantly, does the data support the conclusions, or do the conclusions and the data seem mismatched? Or do you think, as somebody who's been asked, who has expertise in the field, do you think that the conclusions are not supported by the data, and the data is actually trying to tell us something different than what the authors have come to conclude from their study? The limitations should always be clearly stated. Are there limitations? Is it the design? And is the data limited in some way? And is that clearly reported by the author? It should really be like a standout paragraph. Now, with all that in mind, you've read the paper, you've gone through each section. Now go back and think about the whole paper again. Is the title appropriate? Are the keywords appropriate? Does the abstract capture the most salient points of the article? And can you recognize any potential conflicts of interest that might be affecting the interpretation of the results? One example of this is if somebody does a systematic review or a guideline, and they themselves were an author on much of the data that's being used to support that guideline or the conclusions of that systematic review. If so, then it's possible that maybe that author should, it should be mentioned that that author should have recused themselves from the portion of the discussion or something like that. And then readability. Is the use of the language appropriate? And are there run-on sentences? Are there longer sentences? Is there ways that you can make it more readable? Sometimes we find very well-written articles with good science that you can just tell were not written by a native English speaker. And it's reasonable to say, I think this is good science, and I think what you're saying is good, but the article would benefit from a review by a native English speaker. And do you have any corrections of spelling or grammar? Don't get too caught up in the spelling and grammar. I've read a lot of reviews where it's like the introduction gets reviewed ad nauseum for like every comma that's out of place. But by the time you get to the results, there's like no comment on the results or the discussion, because you can tell that the reviewer just sort of like got reviewer fatigue as they went through the article. So make sure that you don't just like spend all your time on this article correcting all the punctuation in the introduction, and then limit your comments about the data analysis and conclusions, which is really what's important. And then go back now and look at all the other stuff. Are there enough tables and figures? Would some of the data presented in the results be clearer if it was presented in the table? If you're looking at a systematic review, does the table include a Prisma diagram, or does the manuscript include a Prisma diagram? Are some of the figures extraneous and just don't add to it and can be removed? And do the legends accurately describe the figures, and are those legends readable? And then look at the references. Are there any key references that are missing? Is there an appropriate number of references? And many journals will offer guidance or have limitations on the number of references for particular article types. So now that you've responded to the author, you're going to respond to the editor. So this is a little bit shorter, but what you'll do is also include a summary statement and a word or two about the appropriateness to the journal. You want to summarize the exceptionally good things and the glaring problems, and then indicate whether or not you think those shortcomings can be corrected with revisions. Be very specific and honest if you think the study is not novel, unethical, or has such major flaws that they can't be corrected with further review, because that just saves everybody time. If you think like, look, this is just not, there's just no way I can make this into a publishable article no matter how many revisions we do, then it just saves everybody time to say, look, we need more data, they need to redo this. To make recommendations, and then your final recommendations usually come in like a drop-down menu or something like that. So That is all I have. I am happy to, I think these slides will be shared, so I encourage you to sort of go back through them and make these checklists as you are reviewing your papers.
Thank you, Stephanie, for talking to us about the importance of checklists helping to guide our review. Next, Jennifer will be introducing our next speaker. So go ahead, Jennifer.
Thank you so much. Next up, we have Dr. Kibbe. Dr. Kibbe is a professor of surgery with tenure and the chair of the Department of Surgery. It keeps coming out of my, switching my screen, sorry. The chair of the Department of Surgery at the University of North Carolina, just down the street from me. She's the editor-in-chief for JAMA Surgery, and her bibliography includes over 200 peer-reviewed manuscripts, review articles, and book chapters, with an emphasis on nitric oxide vascular biology and nitric oxide-based therapies. Dr. Kibbe, thank you for joining us.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that. So I'm actually going to be shifting topics just a little bit from all the other talks. So you all asked me to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion considerations in peer review. And many of you might be going, well, really? Is there much to talk about there? And I'm just going to tell you there's a lot. So I'm just going to briefly touch this topic in the 10 or less minutes here. All right, so as far as this talk, I don't have any disclosures as it pertains to the material that I'm going to show you. I am editor of JAMA Surgery, but these are my views and not the views of JAMA Surgery per se that I'm going to be presenting here. All right, so diversity. So let's just start with, why is diversity important in the peer review process? And I'll just tell you that one of the biggest reasons why I think it is important just happened last year. And it was with the publication of this article in the Journal of Vascular Surgery. It happened in the end of 2020 on the prevalence of unprofessional social media content among young vascular surgeons. I think many people who are on this call, because this is the AWS virtual conference, may be aware of this. Because what happened was this article was published in JVS, and after the publication date, it basically received a tremendous amount of criticism on social media because of the implicit bias present in this publication. So let me just tell you a little bit about this. So the publication looked at unprofessional and potentially unprofessional content of recent vascular surgery graduates in social media, so Facebook, Twitter, etc. And what we then found after this was published is that, well, one, all but one author is male. The 3 data abstractors who abstracted all the data from social media, all 3 were male. The peer reviewers were male. The editors, both editors of the journal were male, and the bulk of the editorial board, might I add. And the author of the invited commentary was male. You can immediately see why this is a great example of why diversity is needed. Because had there been diversity at any point along this spectrum, then perhaps the implicit bias would have been detected, but it went undetected through every aspect. Okay, so let's address this a little bit further. So when it comes to publication bias, it can result from either explicit or implicit ignorance with respect to the impact of race, ethnicity, gender, age, sex, religion, sexual orientation, etc. And when the bias is present, then what happens is the publication can contain data that is not reflective of the population we serve. And the data in the manuscript can actually do harm. So inclusive research results in better healthcare. And inclusive research, I'm going to tell you this, has also been recognized as being more scientifically impactful, and it draws more citations. Now, when it comes to publication bias, this lack of diversity spans the entire peer review process. So of course it can span the research itself. And so everyone on this call who is conducting research, I hope that through this talk, it's going to make you think about your own research. Because another example is if you're doing a project that is looking at say mostly males. Let's talk about any research done in the VA. So is that research really applicable for a greater population? Probably not. So these are the things you need to think about. Authorship, we need diversity there. Peer reviewers, editorial board members, and editors. And we looked at our own discipline of surgery. So some of the recent data is showing that we're now up to around 29% of women, our first, and also I'll say around senior authors. Editorial board members among our surgery journals, we're at about 19% are women. And then for editors in chief, we're just approaching 7%. So we still have a long way to go. And that's just looking at gender. So we don't even have the data on this when it comes to race, ethnicity, etc. We just don't even have it. Now, the implications of this bias are that publications, policies, programs, medical therapies just may not be reflective of the views and the opinions or the outcomes of all, and they could benefit some groups while harming others. So it is imperative that we as a collective eliminate this bias. But to address the bias, we have to first acknowledge that it exists. Then we need to identify it, and then we need to challenge it. So with that, I'm going to put forth a couple of methods for reducing bias. And I will be curious to what some of the other editors also think about what I'm putting forth. So I know Herb looks like he departed. Julianne, be prepared. So I put this in 3 different classes. So first, I think it's important that we mitigate unconscious bias. So all stakeholders that I have mentioned must be made aware of the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, this starts from the day you start a research project to following it all the way through to the ends of the spectrum of getting it published. I do think it's important that journals should develop specific criteria for selecting editors and editorial board members to ensure diversity and also inclusiveness across race, ethnicity, age, religion, gender, etc. I do think that journals must, and notice I put a pretty strong word there, must achieve diversity among editorial board members and editors. And very importantly, journals must achieve diversity among the peer reviewers for every single manuscript. Because again, the manuscript that I showed you is a great example where there lacked diversity among the peer reviewers. And then journals must achieve diversity when they're thinking about invited authorship opportunities. And there needs to be some intentionality when it comes to this. So I am really happy to report that after that article was published with the Surgery Journal Editors Group, Dr. Freischlag and myself had a call to action to all Surgery Journal editors to basically sign on to a pledge to strive for diversity in the peer review process and among the editorial boards and editorial leaders. And I'm super excited to say that today, we currently have 124 out of the 241 surgery journals that have signed on to this living pledge. And you can visit the website that I have at the top. It's under the American College of Surgeons website to see as we have more journals that sign on. Now, the second area I would say is transparency. I think it's important that we increase transparency. So I am a firm believer, and those of you who've heard me talk about the importance of sex and mitigating sex bias in research, it is the same thing. Journals, in my opinion, should require authors to state the demographics, including sex, of the cells, the animals, and the humans in the study. And I wanted to point out this publication just came out last week in JAMA. And this is from one of the managing editors of the JAMA Network, Annette Flanagan. Basically, the AMA has updated their reporting guidelines for race and ethnicity. So I would encourage all of you to take a look at this little 2-page article. I also think, I'm going to put this out there, I think that journals should ask authors to submit a DEI checklist, similar to all of the other checklists we do for reporting guidelines. And this checklist would ensure that the research is free from implicit bias, including requirements to state the demographics of the animal, the cell, and the human. And I also think that all published manuscripts should have a DEI statement. These are simple things that we can do, but it's intentional. And so we need to be intentional about this. I think that journals should be publishing their DEI statistics annually and putting them on their websites when it comes to editors, associate editors, board members, etc. I think that journals should be transparent about editorial board membership criteria so that those who are interested really can understand what the criteria are and apply for positions. And then the last area is on DEI training. So I think this is really important. And I now know all of you are going to go, but oh my gosh, I've been getting hit with DEI training left and right at my home institutions. Well, that is super important, again, because it gets to raising awareness of the issue. And this should start early, medical school, and continue all the way through our faculty practice. But I'm going to tell you that I truly believe we should have DEI training specific to publishing that all editors and editorial board members should go through. And I also think that editors and editorial board members should take the implicit association test. So this is the Association for Women Surgeons He for She Task Force Best Practices. I think it's important. I also think I'm going to go out on another limb and say that I think DEI training specific to publishing should be required for all peer reviewers before they start reviewing for a journal. And peer reviewers and editors should simply certify for each review that DEI principles were adhered to. It could be a simple checkbox on the editorial management website. Again, easy things to do, but being intentional about addressing this issue. So I will conclude with saying that diversity, equity, and inclusion, it really does produce better research, because research that lacks diversity simply may not be applicable to all people. And a lack of diversity in the peer review process may not detect those implicit biases. And so the resultant publications can do harm, significant harm. So diversity does produce better research. Diversity is everyone's issue, not just those affected by underrepresentation. Engaging individuals throughout the entire peer review process with a wide range of perspectives enhances the innovation, and it really does lead to better research. And better, more inclusive research and reporting is going to improve the health and lives of our diverse population. So this, getting back to the title that I was assigned, is why all of us must be engaged and contribute to the peer review process. So with that, thank you, and I'm looking forward to the discussion section period of this panel.
Thanks so much, Dr. Kibbe. Another excellent talk this evening, and we really appreciate you being here. I'm going to hand the baton over to Dr. Zope again.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Kibbe, once again for your wonderful and timely talk. Last but not least in our lineup today, we have Dr. Reinke. Dr. Reinke is an associate professor of surgery in the Division of GI and Minimally Invasive Surgery at Carolinas Medical Center in Charlotte, North Carolina. She is currently the chief editor for the Joint Association of Women Surgeons and American Journals of Surgery issue. Dr. Reinke is also the surgery quality officer for the Atrium Health organization and a surgical outcomes researcher. Welcome, Dr. Reinke.
Good evening, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity to participate in this really fabulous panel. I hope I'm going to bring us home tonight with a brief overview of focusing really on what the AWS AJS mission is, what we hope to do, and again, how to get involved as a reviewer for the issue now that you have all this really great knowledge. So I'll just step back to the overall AWS mission, which is to inspire, encourage, and enable women surgeons to realize their professional and personal goals. And the Association of Women Surgeons goals focus around equity, professional development, and organizational effectiveness. And in this partnership that we have with the American Journal of Surgery, professional development is really where we're focusing the majority of our work. There are 3 ways that this partnership promotes professional development, including inviting members to be reviewers for manuscripts, highlighting the work of our members through authorship, and then participating as a guest editor for the journal. So I got to be a little bit of a historian as I prepared for this talk. And as best that I was able to find out, this history started back in 2013 under an initial proposal to create a career development series, which then transitioned to a council project. And then our initial inaugural editors in 2013 are Dr. Cochran, Dr. Crandall, and Dr. Hollins. When we look back over the work that has been done over this time frame, you see we're missing some of the data in the early years, in the early steps of the process. But you can see that we publish around 20 to 40 manuscripts in each volume of the journal. We have an overwhelming response for reviewers, so really proud of that and the learning and partnership that it facilitates. We have a lot of submissions that get culled down to a lot of manuscripts. And from that, we're select the top ones to get published in the volume. But obviously, there's great work that actually just doesn't have room to be published. And so we're honored to be able to select the top submissions, but also acknowledge that there's a lot of work that gets published that there just isn't room for, or gets presented that just isn't room for. When we look at the impact of the work that goes on around this, you can see that the total citations increase the longer volume has been in print, but that when you look at the number of citations per article per month, we're pretty steady over time, with a recent sort of uptick in the 2020 volume. So that's exciting to think about how that might look in a couple of years. Our systematic reviews are often among our top cited articles, and other well-cited topics from this particular volume include residency, mentorship, and training. We also have some most prolific authors, so you can just see that many of the authors who support this volume with their outstanding work are also leaders in our organization, and that is great to have that support of these national leaders in surgery in the volume. Just for a little clarity for those of you who are new to the process, there are 3 editors. So there's the first year editor who's really learning and understanding the process and participate in the review of the work. The second year editor is the chief editor, and then the senior editor is that third and final year providing oversight and guidance after those 2 years of previous experience. And this is sort of a laundry list of the responsibilities, but it's just important to note that there's actually a ton of work that goes into producing this volume. And we take a lot of time and effort to very carefully review everything that's submitted. So appreciate all the submissions, but also know that we've got a lot that we're looking at and hopeful to help use that to grow our membership as much as possible. When you look at our past editors over the years, so each editor spends 3 years as part of this process, you can see that we've certainly got some of our current and recent leaders of the Association of Women Surgeons who've participated in this. And I think this supports how this editor role can help surgeons further their professional careers and leadership within the organization. Looking back over a shorter time frame, during my 3 years, we transitioned from a call just for titles to titles and abstracts, because we felt the additional information in abstracts really helped us to better review those initial submissions. We've focused on some clarity around the timeline, which is a longer timeline than many other processes. And so we want to make sure that we share that and are transparent about that with the authors. We moved last year from an October to a November publication to better accommodate the presidential address, and also was able to, because of that, move the deadline for the initial submission from what's usually the end, the holiday timeframe to the end of January, and hoping that that was a good fit for the authors. And then this year, for the first time, we've collected reviewer and author information to try to support some of the diversity, equity, and inclusion goals of the organization. So this is the first time we're doing that. We're excited to look at it, hope to have a lot to learn from it. So just a quick overview of the timeline. We're going to get into the nitty gritty. For those of you who are interested, you can see here that the call for reviewers opened on February 1st and will close on March 1st. The initial titles and abstracts were due January 25th, and the notification emails went out yesterday. Then we proceed to having the manuscripts submitted formally to the American Journal of Surgery. Then we invite the reviewers who have volunteered. And unique to this process, I think, is we tend to really try to have a few reviewers from the medical student, resident level, and the attending level. And while many publications may have 2 or 3 reviewers as a routine process, publications that get submitted to this volume tend to have 4 to 6 reviewers. So I think that provides additional input for the reviewers who are particularly new to the process, because they get to see a greater number of other reviewer comments and really work together to make that publication as best as it can be. We do have a 2-week recommended turnaround for reviewers. So as noted previously, please make sure if you accept, and we tried to make that transparent in the call for volunteers. Then the editors will make decisions. Revisions are due from the authors. Then the reviewers get re-invited. So again, this gets back to Dr. Santry's point that you will have an opportunity to re-review this in a time frame for this volume in June. And so hopefully everyone will carve out a little bit of time for that. The second reviews are due, and then we get final decisions in late July to meet a November volume deadline. So for anyone who's interested in volunteering, this is really what that time frame is going to look like, and hopefully you can make time for it in your schedule. So back to the volunteering, there's an interest form online. We'll include that link here, so everyone should be able to access it. If you have any problems with it, please let us know. And so just to sum it all up, the mission of the AWS-AJS partnership is to inspire, encourage, and enable women surgeons to realize their professional goals by providing opportunities to review manuscripts, amplifying the scholarly work of women surgeons, and providing mentored and graduated leadership opportunities through the guest editor positions. So this weekend I was cleaning out my file cabinet. I became a member of the AWS in 2007 and really excited about all the opportunities I've had through this organization since then. I do believe you are all the future. So thank you for being here. And just a quick thanks to the editors who have gone before, Dr. Chen for his ongoing support, and the people who helped pull together the data for this talk tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Renke, for your wonderful talk and for closing us out for the day. I'm going to hand the floor back over to Dr. Hicks.
Great, thanks so much, and thanks to all the speakers. I don't know, Dr. Renke, if you're able to stop screen sharing, and then we can all answer some questions as a panel. So the question and answer session is open, so please send in your questions either by the Q&A or the chat box. We are not answering raised hands as the attendings do not have audio. There's been a few questions rolling in that Dr. Kibbe has been answering. I wanted to sort of sum it up because it basically seems like there's a very common theme, and essentially that is, what exactly is that box that's meant just for the editors, and like, what do you put in there? Dr. Kibbe, do you want to go with that since you've been helping answer some of these?
Yeah, you're right. And there was a theme of questions on that. Please do put comments to the editor in that box. And so I typed the answer. I gave 2 very brief examples. The comments to the editor can be literally 1 sentence. It could be 3 sentences, but it should be super brief and to the point. And so the 2 examples were, one was, I put, this is a great study. It's going to be impactful for the field and highly cited. After they revise it according to my suggestions, it should probably be accepted. Boom, done. Or the other one, a classic one is, while I wanted to like this study, there were critical flaws in the methodology that no revision will ever be able to address. So unfortunately, I recommend reject for this reason. Boom, done. You do not need to repeat all the stuff that you have in your comments to the authors. Something that I see, and I don't know why this ever gets propagated, and I'm sure Julianne will comment on this too, is don't copy and paste the exact comments that you send to the authors and put that in your comment box to the editors. We see everything, so don't do that. So there's comments to the authors, and then something super brief and to the point to the editor. That's like your inner thought,
So thank you for that. I agree completely with you, Dr. Kibbe. Another one that can be helpful is, I think I may have seen this presented at a meeting. So raising the specter potentially of double publication or overlapping publication, where they may not want to do the due diligence, but then it's on the managing editor's office or the editor-in-chief to pursue that. The other place where I think these confidential comments can be helpful is where someone may say, you know, I'm waffling around a decision. And that may help me to say, whoa, there's some ambiguity. I may want to get a deciding third vote or fourth vote to levy which way we're going to go. Because otherwise, you're compelled as a reviewer to say one thing. You can't say, oh, I could go this way or that way. So those would be two more examples of where you could be helpful to the EIC.
Great, thanks. I think that's really helpful. And then a couple of specific, and you spoke on this a little bit, Dr. Sosa, but if somebody worries about plagiarism, should that be addressed in that box or should it be addressed to the authors specifically?
Yeah, I think in the end, these are so politically challenged. You really have to be certain about what you're saying. Cross-check reports probably need to be levied. And then there's a whole pathway that we need to follow. So I think before you put that in the face of the authors, it's important to have a dialogue. And you may want to say, in the confidential comments, this is something I'm concerned about. Let's have a conversation, because it's really hard to summarize complicated stuff like that in, you know, a couple sentences. Like, here's my cell phone, call me and let's discuss it.
Great. Dr. Renke, there was a question from one of the audience members about how, if you want to review a specific type of paper, how can you do that for this this version of the AJS?
Yeah, so in the past, we've asked volunteers to list their areas of expertise in terms of clinical expertise. This year, we added the type of research that you do. So back to Dr. Santry's point about whether you're doing basic science or outcomes research. You may be a trauma surgeon, but those may look very different even within that clinical expertise. So hopefully, as you volunteer for the process, you're able to select a combination of those that identifies what manuscripts would be good for you to review. If you find that you have a nuance in there that you'd like to include, there's also an other option with a free text. If you find that there's something else you think is really important to include, please feel free to reach out. My email was in my slides.
Great, thank you. Dr. McGuire, I think this one is relevant to your talk. How should you best organize your reviews so that you can be viewed and ultimately get onto an editorial board or ultimately as an editor-in-chief?
Just write a lot of them and write a lot of papers. But no, I think that there are several different ways to organize a review. I think mine is just the one that I like to use. But if you stick with something that's complete and consistent and clear, and like Drs. Kibbe and Dr. Sosa said, making sure that you're communicating directly with the editor, that you're saying important things that are really going to help them out. They can speak to this probably better than I can, but I would presume that those people who are particularly helpful are the ones that end up on the editorial boards.
Thanks. Dr. Santry, you mentioned in your talk that one thing that you should think about when you're deciding whether to do a review is whether you're available to do the re-review. What happens if you initially recommended a minor revision and the author made all those changes and you're asked to re-review an article? How do you handle that?
So there are sometimes, depending on your perspective and the perspective of the other reviewers, there may be a disconnect. So there might have been something that you thought, well, these are a couple of minor changes. Someone else might have suggested major changes, or you might have recommended reject. The other reviewers recommended accept. And so what you get back is a document that is a reply to the editor with direct responses or rebuttals to each of the three reviewers. You get to see all of that, and how it's integrated into the manuscript. And so I think it's critically important to sort of give it a fresh view. And this is actually why I put in that slide about, like, are you just burnt out from that specific manuscript if you've seen it multiple times? So especially if you've graded it a reject before, to kind of like cleanse your palate, the way if you're checking out perfumes and you have like coffee to sniff, like just go into it. You have to look at the responses to see if they've responded adequately, but then assess what is this new final product, and does it meet the criteria that are set out in 3 of our talks now. Like, is it appropriate for this journal? Has it reached a quality that is there? Because you still have another opportunity to recommend accept with like a minor change versus reject again. And ultimately the theme editor or the editor-in-chief will make a decision, but you have to honestly approach even that second version, taking into account that the other reviewers may have given different feedback than you.
Great, thank you. Dr. Bond, this is a question that came in on the Q&A and also from one of our panelists. If you review a paper and you feel like it needs a statistician to review it because it's just a little bit above, your head, how do you do that?
Well, I just asked my statistician to do it for me. But that's because we're friends. You can kick it back to the journal, and sometimes there's a little box to check that says I think this needs to be reviewed by a statistician, and they will take care of it for you. And there have been a couple times too where like I read the abstract or I read the title and think, oh, hey, I can do this. And then I start to get into the weeds of the paper and I feel like I'm a little in over my head in terms of background. Like, do I really have the background for this? And, so I'll phone a friend and see, somebody who does have expertise.
Yeah, that's helpful. I'll open that up to the rest of the panel as well. Is this something that should just go back to the box to the editor, or how else is another ways to handle this?
Yes, I answered this question already. Yes, in the comments to the editor, just simply say this manuscript needs to be reviewed by a biostatistician, period. And then depending on the extent, you can put something very nice to the authors, like the methodology or et cetera could benefit from, involvement of a biostatistician, something like that.
Great.
Even one of the things that you might give as a matter of feedback is that the biostatistical methods would benefit from more clarity, so that a reader without a statistical background can understand why they did propensity scoring or a generalized linear model or those kinds of things, right? People understand chi-squared tests, student t-tests, linear regression, maybe a Cox proportional model. And then that's sort of where most people's capacity to understand complicated things, unless they have a PhD, ends. And so sometimes it's not that the methods were incorrect, it's that they have not been explained in the methods section well enough. And that's important feedback that you can give in your review if you have that expertise. Or you can say, to someone without biostatistical expertise, the methods are not clear and would benefit from better language to translate, why you did what you did.
Great. There was a comment on here that Dr. Kibbe answered about, what do you say to individuals who claim there are not enough qualified women to review manuscripts? And I love your answer that it's just frankly ridiculous. But to sort of take that a next step further, how do people on this call get more involved in reviewing besides this AWS issue of AJS? How, Dr. Kibbe, if someone wants to review for JAMA surgery, how does somebody do that? Dr. Sosa.
They just send me an email. And I put them in my database, and trust me, you'll start getting some manuscripts. So you can reach out to the associate editors, deputy editors, and just say, hey, I am, I've authored manuscripts. This is my area of expertise. I would love to review papers. I will never say no to free volunteers.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Dr. Kibbe. And I think one is you need to be visible. So you need to be an author. You need to be on the podium, giving posters and writing, so that people start to see you as somebody who occupies some field. I think a second thing to do to sort of augment what Dr. Kibbe said is to reach out to your mentor, senior authors, people at your institution in positions of power, express your interest, but also say, can I help you review? Now, you don't want to be slave labor. You don't want to just do it and not be recognized for it. So one thing I try to do, and I'm interested in if others on the panel do this, is if I invite a junior faculty member or learner to help me, when I submit my review, I prominently in capital letters say, this review was completed with the assistance of my junior faculty member star so-and-so at this email. Her or his expertise is such and such. And I will tell you, this works. Why? Because too many people are saying no. When people actually say yes, like Dr. Kibbe said, we're like, sign them up. And we just had a junior faculty member who has just become a peer reviewer at another journal. The editor-in-chief saw it and said, hey, are you okay? Should I go ahead and ask her to review for us? I said, yeah, don't ask me anymore, ask her. And so now she's doing regular reviews. So 2 other pathways.
Can I add to Julianne's comments? Because there are quite a few questions in the Q&A box from interns, residents, and medical students asking how to peer review. So to clarify what Julianne said, so most journals, you need to be a faculty member in order to be a peer reviewer. So I want to make sure the residents and trainee and medical students know that. But that's what Julianne means by go to your mentor and say, hey, I want to learn how to peer review. So can I peer review some articles with you? And there'll be articles that your faculty member has been assigned to review. So just to make that super clear, you need to be an author yourself on several papers before you start peer reviewing yourself too. I answered that in the Q&A.
And also, and I think Dr. Reinke wants to say something, and I don't want to interrupt. Just to finish that thought, ask your mentor to review your review with you and provide feedback, right? Like, did I get it right? And then she or he can say, well, I disagreed with your final recommendation, but your thought process was really good, because you want to improve, right? Sorry, Dr. Reinke, please go ahead.
No, appreciate it. Thanks. I just want to clarify that for this particular volume, we do invite medical students and residents to volunteer to review. And I just want to highlight that that's something that we do with an additional labor of love from the editors. So we'll typically invite, 1 or 2 residents, and always have a minimum number of faculty, and may invite a medical student as well. And then we are able to take all of those, and we take the reviewer comments knowing the level of training of that reviewer, and are able to sort of weigh them based on that input. So we sometimes get really fabulous ones from medical students and residents because they're taking more time and give more input. But we do invite those AWS members to participate in this volume in particular as part of our partnership and our goals. So that's a little bit different again for the AWS, AJS than for the journals that Dr. Kibbe and Dr. Sosa are speaking about.
I think that's a great sort of wrap up point here for the AWS webinar. I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Henry to say good night and thank you to everyone.
Thank you so much, everyone, for a wonderful panel. This was very useful information, and I really appreciated some new takes on the topic as well. There have been a lot of talks on this recently, but I think we added some different perspectives to the overall process, and I appreciate our panelists for such an outstanding discussion this evening. I think there were a couple last questions in the Q&A that are getting some typed answers right now. So we'll let that get finished. And otherwise, thank you again to our panelists, to the wonderful webinar committee for putting this together, and go out and write and review.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you.